Hello, I'm Butch Curry from Zombie Nirvana Games. Welcome to the fourth installment of Fantasy Cartography with Adobe Photoshop, the podcast where I give you some of my favorite tips, tricks, and techniques to create cool maps for your role-playing games. Last week, we created a custom pattern and applied it to our map with a pattern fill layer. If you'll remember, one of the advantages of using a pattern for a forest like this is that it looks like you've carefully hand-drawn hundreds and hundreds of trees, when really you've drawn maybe a couple of dozen. If you really want to make it look like you've slaved over your forest, there are a couple of kind of sneaky tricks that you can use, and that's what we're going to talk about this week. But before we dive in, a couple of folks have asked about layer masks, since I use them so much in my map making. Rather than take up time in the podcast to go over them, I created a tutorial over at zombienirvana.com that you can check out if you want a little more information. Now let's get started on this week's lesson. You might have noticed that I've created a different pattern than the one I whipped up for last week's episode. Not just because this one looks a little nicer, but because it's got some elements in it that are going to help us illustrate this first trick. I'm going to define this as a pattern, just like we did last week. I'm going to call this Forest 1. Come back over here, add the pattern layer, just like we did last week. Scale it down. That looks pretty good. Switch it to multiply. Invert the mask. Now, before I do anything else on here, I'm going to get kind of a head start and duplicate this layer. You'll see why in a minute. I'm going to come back down here. I'm going to grab my brush, make sure I've got white as the foreground color. There we go. And I'm just going to brush some forest in up here. And you're going to see right away one of the problems with using a pattern over a large area like this. You can see that the pine trees that I added into this particular pattern show up at regular intervals on the map. And that really kind of gives away the fact that you've used a pattern here instead of drawing everything by hand. Since that's not what we're trying to do, we want to make it look like we've really slaved over it. I'm going to switch my brush back over to black, and I'm just going to take a few chunks out of this. I'm just going to kind of break the forest up a little. That's good for now. And then I'm going to come back over here to my pattern. Now, I'm going to come up here to Filter, down to Other, over to Offset. I'm going to use the same settings that I used last week when I was creating the pattern. Nothing fancy there. I'm also going to select everything by hitting Control-A. Then coming over here to Edit, down to Transform, and over to Flip Horizontal. Just like that. And deselect. Now I'm going to define this as a pattern by coming up to Edit, Define Pattern, and I'm going to call this Forest 2. I'm going to come back over to the map, and now on this second pattern layer that I created earlier, double click on it, come over here to the pattern drop down, and here at the end is Forest 2 that I created just now. Hit OK. Now I'm going to come back over here with my brush and just brush this new forest layer in. Because it's been shifted and flipped, those elements that were showing up at regular intervals before are going to be disguised. So now wherever you want to just bring in some of the new forest, you can switch back and forth on your brush between black and white. And brush your forest in on the two separate layers. Just like that. This doesn't look that great yet, but I still have to go in and neaten up the edges, like I explained in last episode. I'm going to pause the video for just a moment while I do that, because that's going to lead us directly into the next trick. And we're back. As you can see, I've cleaned up the edges of the forests, and turn them from one giant repetitive forest into some more natural looking clumps with the pattern moved around and shifted slightly to make it look less pattern-like. Before I get into the next big trick, I'm going to show you one quick little one that I like to use just to kind of make the edges look a little nicer. I'm going to grab my brush, set to black, with the opacity cut down to 40%, and just kind of dim the edges out a little bit to make it look like maybe the ink is worn off a little bit around the edges. Just like that. Just gives it a little more natural look than having the hard lines run right up to the edge like it did before. Now, one thing we can also do to really help sell our forest look is to give it some tree trunks. You could go in and do all these just individually by hand, but of course there's always a way to maybe do it a little bit faster. What we're going to do is we're going to make a new document. Just like the pattern we made last week, it has a size of 1 inch by 1 inch, a 600 dpi resolution, and set to grayscale. We're going to use this to make a custom brush. I'm going to grab my brush, make sure it's set back to 100%, and I'm just going to draw a tree trunk. Just like that. And fill it in with black. Make sure it goes all the way out to the edge there. This is not the world's greatest tree trunk, but shrunk down to the size we're going to be seeing at, it is going to look just fine. Now we're going to go up here to Edit, Define Brush, just like we did Define Pattern last week. We're going to call it Tree Trunk. Hit OK. Come back to our map. As you can see, that is way too big, so we're just going to shrink it down a bit until it gets closer to the size that we want. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to make a new layer. Always like to work on a new layer. And I'm going to zoom in over here. But before I start putting it down, I want to make sure that the tree trunks don't look too uniform. So I'm going to pull up the brush palette. Oops. You have to make sure you have a brush selected before you do that. Pull up the brush palette. There is my tree trunk. I'm going to come to brush tip shape. Spread the spacing out a little bit so I can see it a little better. There we go. I'm going to come into shape dynamics. I'm going to give it a little bit of size jitter, but I'm going to turn the control off. That's just going to make it random. I'm also going to give it a little bit of roundness jitter. That's also going to change the size and shape of them a little bit. Again, I'm going to leave the control off. Right there looks pretty good. Oops. Shrink it down to size. Maybe about 15 pixels will look good. That's good. And I'm just going to go through and just kind of dot in some tree trunks real quick. Just like that. Then, in between these trunks, I'm going to shrink this down and put some smaller ones that look like they're kind of fading back into the background. Just like that. Doesn't take any more time than that. Zoom back out to size, and you can see that's starting to look pretty good. I have a lot to talk about when it comes to coloring a map like this. Since we're kind of running short on time this week, I'll save that for next week's episode. I will take just a moment to point out that what we're doing here doesn't require any kind of huge artistic skill. If you want to be a great map maker, that takes a lot of artistic skill. But just to make something that's going to be kind of cool for you and your friends to enjoy at the gaming table, you don't really have to be a great artist. You just have to take a little time and have a few tips and tricks up your sleeve. Once you've got those, trust me, you can do it. That's going to do it for this week. Keep checking back at zombienirvana.com for updates on this podcast, my upcoming fantasy cartography book, and my weekly Photoshop tips. You can also contact me there if you have any questions, comments, or requests for future podcasts or tips. Thanks for listening, and happy mapping!